It's Halloween. This is not a graveyard, nor a mausoleum or anything else dead, aside from maybe a few people's dignity, as it happens. But this is a different deal here for drinking with dead people because it's Halloween. Are we going to be talking about some history? Absolutely. This is the Halloween special, Drinking with Dead People, and you're going to hear in this episode some stories, local favorites from in and around this area that I live in here in Memphis. A couple of really interesting stories, and one that has a lot of history with a bit of creepiness on top. That's the fun. So, grab yourself an appropriate beverage of some sort, relax, sit back, and enjoy the Halloween special as we go drinking with dead people.
Every stone marks a story. Interesting stories, people like you and I. History that should be recounted. Here we toast those you may or may not know who have gone on before us and left behind their tales to be told. Here we'll be drinking with dead people.
On this Halloween, it seems appropriate to talk about maybe a couple of things that tend to come up around this time of year. The whole majesty and the fun of drinking with dead people has been about the history, of course. But, of course, the holiday, if you want to call it that, of Halloween. All Saints' Day would be November the 1st. The Day of the Dead, Dia de los Muertos, for those of the Spanish-speaking folk, and the Latin experience that comes with that, and everything that goes with it. That's not what this episode is about by any means. In this town, like many other cities, there are several local folk tales, if you will. Some of them more recent than others. But I figured this time it'd be nice to sit down with a cocktail away from the peace and the quiet of a cemetery. After all, they're probably pretty busy being dead, as it happens, and tell a few stories. Ghost stories, if you'd like, from local legend. Two of which don't really have much basis in fact, but a third one absolutely does. And that's what we'll get into. We'll start with a story about a woman whose spirit has been seen, her ghost, if you will, has been seen in a local park. Overton Park in Midtown Memphis is home to a particular little man-made lake called Rainbow Lake. It's not very big, maybe 100 feet wide by, maybe 20 feet across, or maybe more, maybe 30 feet across. And it's got little turtles in it and things like that, and it's, like I said, it's man-made. I don't think you can drown in it. It's only probably about maybe 2 or 3 feet deep at its deepest. But yet there's a story about people who have encountered a woman, the Lady of the Lake, as she is often known, dressed in a light blue dress, sometimes in the early evening hours before the sun sets. She might be seen standing on the banks of this little lake, reaching her hand out as though looking for help. And as people would approach her, she would just vanish into thin air. And it's created a kind of a fun little folklorish talk around town, and it's been that way for quite some time. But of course, the longer the years go by, the less we hear of her. So who was she? What is the story? What's going on here? No one knows. That's the interesting thing about it. One story, of course, being handed down from, mouth to ear over the years, has claimed that there was a woman who had been raped and stabbed on the bank of that lake and left there to die. But there's no record of any such incident that happened at any particular time across any research, from newspapers to police reports. Other stories attribute her to being a woman who was scorned, perhaps by her soon-to-be husband, who decided to leave her for someone else, and thus she went to drown herself in said lake. But as I mentioned before, that lake is pretty shallow. You would have to really work hard to drown yourself. We don't know her name, we don't know anything about her, and certainly we don't even have a headstone. But it's a fun little tale nonetheless. So if you happen to be in Overton Park in the early evening hours just before the sun sets and you see a woman in a light blue dress and she holds her hand out for help, perhaps you should approach her and perhaps you should offer some assistance just so you can watch her vanish into thin air. It's a fun story, don't you think? To downtown. Downtown Memphis is the home of a great mini venue down there. It's also the home of Beale Street. And it's the home of one of the Mid-South's premier venues. It's the Orpheum Theater. It's been around a long, long time. It's a beautiful place. It seats about 2,100 people. Broadway-type shows come through there all the time, and sometimes in the summertime they turn it into an actual movie theater, which I believe is what it was built for originally. But it's got a nice deep stage, and there's a lot of shows that have come through there over the years. And there's the story of Mary. Mary's a 5-year-old little girl who is said to have died somewhere outside the Orpheum Theater and has since found her way in the afterlife. If that is heaven, well, I don't know what to tell you. But she is said to occupy seat C5 and box 5 in the mezzanine. And her presence there is yet another mystery. There are plenty of people who will corroborate all sorts of stories about seeing her and experiencing her presence. In fact, Yul Brynner was here back in the 70s in performance of a show there at the Orpheum Theater and is said to have encountered this little girl and was pretty spooked by it. But there are stories, and she's not really malevolent, but there are stories that you could kind of upset her to the point where she'll make some noise or maybe throw things around, but nothing huge, nothing big, nothing really major. It's said that if you encounter her, you're supposed to be kind of nice. That would be the ideal thing. The story's been around a long time, and of course, like any of the other long stories that go around, we don't know who this Mary girl is. Some theories say that she got hit by a passing trolley, which the trolley line runs in front of it, or she was knocked down by a horse and carriage type of situation and somehow found her way inside, maybe was carried in to find some type of help, or she would have later passed away, or a whole number of things that would have come out of this. Some say she just wandered in after she had passed away to find herself in the mezzanine to watch every show that came through there. Maybe so. I don't know. Other stories suggest that there were friends that have joined her who vowed to sit with her until she found herself going to the light and finding herself in the proper place to be, whatever that may be, in the afterlife. Nevertheless, it's a fun story, and I'm glad to bring that to you here. Now, this story. This is something. April 27, 1865. A date's pretty important, and we'll get to that in a moment. Because here in Memphis, in reality about 7 miles north of Memphis, by riverboat about an hour, sailed the Sultana. It was a steamboat. Some of you watching this probably know what I'm talking about in the story that I'm going to get into. And it goes into great detail, of which we don't really have time here for all of that. But I highly recommend you do your research and look more into this fascinating story. But I'll give you the nuts and bolts right here. You see, the Sultana was operated by a man by the name of Captain James Mason. He was from St. Louis, Missouri. And he ran various goods and people up and down the Mississippi River from St. Louis down to New Orleans and back, and often stopping at all the places along the way, Memphis being one of them. Well, the war had come basically to an end at this point, and the South had freed a bunch of the prisoners of war, soldiers from the North. And there was a deal to get those men back up north, back to their homes, north of the famed Mason-Dixon line. Well, not to be short of an idea to make some money, Captain Mason brings the Sultana on down. Now, he made a few stops along the way for other bits of business, but ultimately he winds up in Vicksburg, Mississippi, where he meets a couple of individuals that decide that they're going to contract his boat to bring these men back up. And so he agrees to do so at the cost of about $2.75 of money back in 1860. $2.75 per person, per enlisted man, $8 per officer. And not to mention there were some other passengers, there were civilians, and there was some cargo and things. And they were going to come up north. They were going to go upstream from Vicksburg all the way up north, up into St. Louis and further north to get these passengers and these now extricated prisoners of war back to their families because of the war being ending. Well, he didn't want to lose any money on this whole thing, so he quickly loaded his boat, and he loaded it up full, beyond full. Some 2,100 people were on board this thing. A lot of people, considering that the Sultana was only built to carry no more than 375 people, which included the 85 people that were her crew. Well, Captain Mason wasn't, going to lose out on any of this, so he loaded that boat as full as he possibly could. That was the first mistake. On his way north, up the Mississippi River, he comes to Memphis, where by this point the boat is having some trouble, as you can clearly understand, with having that many people on board. It just wasn't designed to handle that kind of load. So they pulled into Memphis, where 200 of those soldiers disembarked and went on about their way. The rest of the passengers and crew stayed aboard while certain repairs were made, and those repairs being boiler leaks, boiler stresses. There were 4 boilers on board. Being a steamship, you had to have the boilers, these giant iron tanks filled with water that they could take from the river and heat up to steam and turn the big wheel that would make the boat move. Well, engineers and technicians and steel workers told him directly that to really affect the proper way to fix these boilers, they would need to come out, they would need to be cut, and patches would have to be put back in there or replace the boiler completely. Well, Captain Mason knew that this was just not going to be a thing, because it would have delayed their journey, their voyage north by several days, and that couldn't possibly be a reality for him. He had to get these people up. He was going to lose all this money. And those people that were on board would not have had the patience to stay, so they would have left. And that would have been a big problem for him, because he wasn't going to get paid until he got north. So the idea was that the engineers would put a smaller, thinner piece of steel over some of the areas on these boilers to temporarily patch them, to send them on their way. And that repair job would take about a day, which worked out because there was a bunch of cargo that came on board, and there was a bunch of stuff that had to come off board, and that would facilitate the trip. And off he went. It was 2 a.m., April 27, 1865. The Sultana was about 7 miles north of the city of Memphis, about an hour by boat. And you got to remember, the Mississippi River, even though it flows from north to south, also flows from east to west in some weird ways, because as it erodes part of the bank, the river will move and change directions. That becomes kind of important a little bit later on. Approximately 2 a.m. on the morning of April 27, 1865, the boilers exploded. It was horrific. Massive fire. The boat, what was left after the explosion, had burned down to the waterline. Bodies flung everywhere. Some vanished. They never could find Captain Mason ever again. There were people that were scalded to death. Imagine that horrific thing. Parts of the stacks falling into the people that were standing up there on the top deck of the boat. It was so top heavy, and the boilers weren't boiling right, and of course they just couldn't handle the load, and they exploded. Many of the people went over the side because it was either stand there and burn to death or take their chances in a rather cold Mississippi River. The choice is pretty obvious for most people. The currents carrying them back down south toward Memphis proved to be pretty fatal for some. They couldn't swim, so groups of survivors were clinging together to try and make it back to the shore. Some were clinging onto the sides of other boats that had come at this point for rescue. That's a pretty important part of the story, too. Eventually, some of the bodies on both sides of the river had washed ashore. It had been months until all the bodies had been pulled from the river, some as far south as back in Vicksburg. It's a pretty horrific thing. In fact, it was so horrific, it is the largest maritime disaster to have ever occurred within the United States of America. So how many died? Nobody really knows. There wasn't really a full exact count of that. There were a number of survivors for sure. Some estimates put it around 1,100 as fatalities. That's a lot of people, which would put it at around 500 to 600 people that did survive it. They formed the Sultana Survivors Association. There were 2 versions of that organization, too. One in the South, which was anchored and headquartered in Knoxville, Tennessee, and another one up north, which was headquartered in St. Louis. And they met every year until the last one died in 1941, the last survivor. It's a horrific deal. Now, the reason why the date, April 27, 1865, why this is important? Well, it's quite simple, really. Because it wasn't covered in the media. Why? 6 days before, April 27th, 1865, Abraham Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theater. It died in the media. It died in the papers. It was an unfortunate thing. It's a fantastic story. If you happen to be around the area, you can go to Marion, Arkansas, which is just north of what is known as West Memphis, Arkansas. There's a museum there and a memorial there. Not much is there. Several years, way later, like in 1980, they found, about 100 years later, they found bits of wreckage up underneath a field. Why would it be in a field? As I mentioned, the river moves east to west as well. And about 30 or 40 feet below the surface, they found bits of wreckage, which they do believe to be that of the ill-fated Sultana. As for who was at fault, no one really knows there either. The captain vanished. Well, quite literally. He was vaporized by the explosion because it took out the wheelhouse and it took out most of his crew that were there with him. The people he had done business with down in Vicksburg to overload the boat in the first place, some of them were held accountable. But eventually they were all acquitted. The fault being quite simply that the boat was overloaded and overstressed and unable to handle the load. Now, because it's Halloween, I have to tell you this. It had been told for many years after that accident that other riverboat captains coming back and forth, because it's a 24-hour operation, the river traffic, that sometimes around 2 a.m., a faint flaming glow could be seen on the horizon just north of Memphis from the river. And as the boat captains reported, some have, as they get near to where the Sultana went down, they could hear the screams of burned passengers trying to climb aboard their own boats to save themselves from a horrific shipwreck. Makes for a fun story. Don't know how true all that is. Depends on what you believe. I mean, after all, it's been told that in a recent survey, about 1 in 5 people believe in ghosts. 1 in 3 of those people believe they have had an actual physical encounter with them. Whatever the case may be, it makes for fun. It makes for a nice Halloween, which I hope you have a wonderful fall season. So for all of those who have lost their lives in the attempt to bring some stories to you, well, we salute you. Whether it's the lady by the lake who died for whatever reason, or whoever she may be, or wherever she may be buried, we may never know, or if she existed at all, or the little girl in the popular theater who apparently still likes to go to a show, or the some 1,600 people who perished in the Mississippi River trying to find their own freedom. Either way, it's a wonderful bit of story. We hope you enjoyed it. Join us again next time as we wander among the headstones of history and go drinking with dead people.